So thanks everybody for joining. One of the things we definitely found in working on the ESS-DIVE repository is the challenges with sort of working with evolving standards. And I think this is a good opportunity for us to have a conversation with all of you about some of those challenges. We're going to first give you some background sort of about the current state of the art and some of the things that are less well resolved. And then we'd like to have a conversation also about sort of where we go from here. So I will turn it over to Joan.
Okay, so can you all see this now?
Yes.
Slides? Okay, good. So one thing is if you check the chat, and if someone could repost that if needed, we have a link to a survey for you to complete to kind of gauge where everyone in the audience is with regards to data citation. And you can kind of look at some of those while we get started. So my name is Joan Damrow, and I work on community engagement for the ESS-DIVE data repository. And today we'll be discussing data citations. And we really want to focus on the perspective of data contributors and users. And we want this to be interactive. So again, we're starting with this survey to get an idea of where we are, some of the motivations and concerns around data citation in the audience. And also as we go, we encourage you to ask any questions, or if you have comments, you can bring them up in the chat anytime for sure. So throughout the webinar, we will discuss, like I mentioned, data citation really from the perspective of data contributors and users. And we'll start with the live survey results. We'll move on to focus on data contributor needs for sharing and publishing data and the associated citations. And this kind of leads into some general citation principles and goals. And we'll go over some recommendations and examples of data citations in ESS-DIVE specifically and also elsewhere. And then we'll focus more on some concerns of data users and challenges and options, particularly for citing large numbers of data sets. So now we can move into some of the survey results. So if you haven't visited the link provided in the chat, please do that now and let me know if you need help with that, or if you need the link to be posted again. Let's see. Has anyone completed this?
So Joan, did you hit start on it? Has anybody been able to?
I did.
Oh, okay.
I did hit start.
Okay, yeah, I see that Elisha said that she was able to do question 1, so.
I think it's just you have to finish the whole thing before these results start showing. I don't think it's doing it by question. And there are some of the last ones are kind of long. So
okay, well, we can just take a minute to kind of think about some of these, and then we'll get an idea of where everyone is at in just a minute. And if for some reason the results don't show up, then we can switch to another way to see them. Has anyone finished?
yeah, Joan, I tried and I did manage to finish it, but I don't think it's showing up here. So there's something going on.
All right, let me look at the poll everywhere side of things, see if I'm seeing. Huh. Yeah, I actually don't I don't see results here either. That's pretty weird. Has anybody else finished?
There's a couple.
Sarah said, Sarah and
Yes.
Drew and Kristen all said they finished.
Yes.
It says at the bottom to
Okay.
start the presentation to see live content. I don't know if that,
Yeah, it may be that the integration with the slides isn't working for some reason. So
So Joan, can you restart your presentation? Maybe they'll show up then.
okay. Nope. Okay.
Maybe we should just keep
I think,
going.
yeah, let me. We can just look at it here. Yeah, for some reason this isn't. viewing.
Yeah, that first one's not working, but the other ones are.
Okay, just to get an idea. So what's your experience with data publication and citation? Okay, we have a wide variety here. Where have you cited data thus far? Looks like people are citing in the reference section, but there's some variability. And some people have never cited. What circumstances would motivate you to share data? Looks like the top one is increased impact and visibility. And then also public benefit and greater transparency, funder requirement, and full citation. And then what problems or concerns do you have with sharing data sets? Lack of time to deposit data, which isn't surprising. Not receiving appropriate credit or acknowledgement, which is relevant here. Okay, skip back. Okay, thanks for being patient with working through that. Okay, so now we'll move on to discussing some issues with data contributors and authors of data sets regarding sharing their data and associated citations. And so this should look familiar. This question and the options were included in a survey that was run by Digital Science and Springer Nature. This is the largest and longest running survey on open data sharing, and it included 4,500 respondents in 2020 globally. And in this survey, and this is across disciplines, a full data citation was actually a little bit surprisingly the top motivator for sharing data, followed by increased impact and co-authorship on papers and public benefit. And then about a third of respondents were concerned about not receiving appropriate credit or acknowledgement for sharing data. And I wanted to point this out in particular because it's relevant to our conversations today about the purpose of data citations and what we want to do for data contributors. So a data package or a data set can be used, the terms can be used interchangeably. And so I just want to point that out here because sometimes I'll refer to either a data package or a data set. And this really refers to the combination of both the data files and metadata describing the content and scope of what those files include. The data package metadata is particularly designed to enable others to find and access the data. And some of this is used in the data citation. And then when published, each data package is assigned a DOI. And this is the persistent identifier most often used in papers and data sets. And it provides a permanent and machine readable link online to that data set. I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page with terms and that we'll be using throughout the talk. So a major consideration when you're working on your data package and about to submit is how do you decide what actually goes in a data package? And when doing this, you really want to consider how the data will be reused and cited. And so the ultimate citation is actually a really important thing to think about when making this decision. And some common approaches that we see include packaging the data based on things like author contribution. So who might be, what the author order might be and who might be the first author. You may also organize by a particular data type, which can facilitate reuse in many cases. Or data may be organized into a package based on a particular field campaign or season that need to be viewed together. And another common practice, especially for smaller projects, may be to put all data that goes into a particular journal publication into a particular data package. So you can reference that as a single data package. Also, when you publish a data package on ESS-DIVE, one of the requirements is to specify the data usage license for your data sets. And all public data sets in ESS-DIVE are shared openly under one of these two data usage licenses, the Creative Commons Attribution. And this requires that the data package be cited by anyone using the data, or the Creative Commons public domain dedication license. And this dedicates the data to the public domain without restriction. So
Joan, can I just bring up one clarification?
Yeah, sure.
Creative Commons by attribution requires that you provide attribution, and then the site is expected to tell you what attribution means. So in our case at ESS-DIVE, we provide the citation that we expect. So just so that people don't think that CC by 4 automatically means a citation.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. And you can find the data usage rights for a particular data package right on the landing page. You can find it usually at the bottom of the dataset landing page. It'll indicate the specific license. And really, in any case, we recommend that you would cite the data to enable others to access it and to clearly indicate that in your publications. So while we're considering some concerns or requirements for data contributors, I also wanted to bring up an important field to complete in your ESS-DIVE metadata, and that's related references. And this is a way to provide citations actually within your data package. And you can provide citations for, it's currently a really flexible field, and you can list associated papers in this field, also link citations for other data sets used or related data. You may also include links and citations to methods or protocols that might be published. And this is just an example of a related reference for an ESS-DIVE data set. So in the future, we may be changing this. This field is currently very flexible, where you can enter a string of citations. We may change that to have more specific related identifiers and relationship types to really specify exactly how that citation is related to the data set, like an associated paper or a new version, or to indicate that these are data sets that are included in a particular data package. So this field is pretty important, particularly for multidisciplinary sciences, where you really may need to link related and diverse data in order to understand scientific conclusions. And we can, in the future, use this to build tools around improving the efficiency of data management and reuse for multidisciplinary sciences, where again, you really want to be able to link related data. And in general, we want to make sure that we have these clear and consistent linking, especially between data sets and any associated papers. And as we'll discuss in a minute, this can help with data usage metrics moving forward. So I'll move on to discuss a little bit about data set citation purpose and examples. So a generally accepted definition for data citation is a reference to data for the purpose of credit attribution and facilitation of access to the data. So the two key things here are credit and access. And what a data citation does in addition is really help us recognize the value of data in the research process. And in many cases, and in many disciplines, the paper alone isn't sufficient anymore to really understand and judge the strength of some of our scientific conclusions, particularly in data-intensive fields. And so we want to normalize this citation more to emphasize this. And then we can start to translate attributions into reward for individuals. So the Joint Declaration of Data Citation Principles was developed in 2014, and there's a lot of detail here in text, but the point here is to point out some of the importance of the data citation and what ideally should be included in a citation. So I just wanted to point out a couple of the key points, and one of those is just, again, importance, that data should really be highlighted as a legitimate product of research and really necessary to understand scientific contributions. And we see credit and attribution here again, which is really important for data contributors. And citations also provide a clear access to evidence. Whenever we have a claim that relies on data, we provide a citation. And it promotes what we want to do as citations also is to promote interoperability and flexibility. And so our data citation methods should really be flexible so that we can accommodate variant practices. And we're really used to this in the journal publication world when we publish papers, because every journal has a slightly different citation format. Data citations also help make data fair. Some of you may be familiar with this already, but the FAIR principles, we want to make sure that data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the citation metadata and the persistent DOI that's associated with data sets really make finding and accessing data much easier. And as we've mentioned a couple times now, one key purpose of citation is providing credit to the data contributors. And in ESS-DIVE, Each data package has metrics available on the number of data package views, downloads, and citations. And you can select this Citations button here to view any papers that have cited your data sets. One current issue here is that many publishers aren't currently reporting data citations. Many of them do, but we're finding that some of them don't. So there's a little more work to do here in holding journal publishers accountable and ensuring that they implement standards for tracking and submitting data citations. And so there are groups working on this issue. The Make Data Count effort in particular is a global community-led initiative that's really focused on the development of open research data metrics. And so they've been making progress on this issue along with others. And I also want to point out that what you can do now is if you know of citations for your data package and they're not included in these metrics, you can report them to us and let us know. We can add those manually, and we can also follow up with particular publishers if needed. Okay, so if you visit the poll again, we can see if this works this time, or if not, I can do the same as before. So let me know when you've completed this, and if it doesn't work, I'm going to switch. Okay, has everyone had a chance to do that? Looks like we have a pretty even split on whether data sets should be counted equally, or they should be counted, but maybe with less weight than papers, which makes sense. Okay, thank you for filling that out. Okay, so with this slide, I just wanted to point out that data citations are relatively new, especially when compared to literature citations. They're also more complex, and we still have some issues to work through, and Deb will discuss some of those later. But we are working towards improving the landscape here, and people, particularly in the digital library community, are really aware of this and are working towards improvements. Okay, so what's included in a data citation, a basic data citation, and this is an ESS-DIVE formatted citation. And what you really want to include is anything that will enable us to provide credit and to access and locate the data sets. So in general, that includes the authors, the date that it was published, a title, which should be descriptive and easy to understand with no unexplained acronyms that. And then also we have a publisher or repository where you can find the data set. For ESS-DIVE, we allow users to indicate their projects. And this is because for many projects, that use ESS-DIVE, they're pretty large scale, long-term projects that are already well established in the community. And this is really what people know, and it enables people to find the data set and understand what that data is. In this case, it is ESS-DIVE, but I'll show you another example in a minute. The other component is the DOI, and this is, again, the globally unique and persistent ID that doesn't change over time, and it allows us to access and track the impact of data sets over time. So here are a couple other examples of a data citation. This is the ESS-DIVE citation again, with the authors and the date. In this case, you see that the publisher or repository is the project, which is the watershed function SFA. However, if you view this same data set on data one, the publisher will be set as the repository, which is ESS-DIVE. Just so you're aware of some of the variation that you might see in these. The data one citation also has a version number here. But again, the DOI doesn't change. So you can cite an ESS-DIVE data package very easily using directly from the dataset landing page using this copy citation button. And that's where you find this formatted citation that we've seen in the past slides. And again, the metadata fields that you fill out when you submit a data set will determine how this citation will look. We're considering some changes to ESS-DIVE citations, and I've highlighted those in yellow here. We may, in addition to the project, add ESS-DIVE to the publisher repository field, and then also add the general resource type, which in most cases is a data set. And this may help clarify what exactly the citation is when it's cited in papers. And then we want a way to better indicate where the data set was accessed, because in many cases the data may be replicated in project repositories or websites, or or in data one. And so we have this access via, and then there's a permanent link to the data set on ESS-DIVE, and then an access date. And this helps us identify the specific version of data if that's needed. Okay, so now we can switch over to Deb as the speaker, and she'll be discussing some citation complexities and challenges.
So Joan, do you want to quit sharing your screen and I'll share mine?
Sure, if that's.
Okay. So I want to talk about some of the complexities. It won't be all of them because I also want to leave plenty of time for discussion. But some of the challenges that we're seeing. Okay. So one of them is handling of versions, right? Real data is rarely static. There are cases where it is, but often it's revisited and recalibrated or added to, or there were, mistakes in the metadata, things like that. And a challenge right now is that the formal guidance from the digital library space says you must make a new DOI every time anything changes about it, including many recommendations say even if it just changed repositories, even though it was exactly the same. The challenge is that's very confusing for the users and for later tracing the credit for things, because and just when you think about the reusability aspect, you kind of want to be able to find, if it's the exact same data and the exact largely, you kind of want to be able to find it very easily. And I think idea of putting new DOIs on every time anything changes is not necessarily effective. So we actually in ESS-DIVE allowed that it's up to the user to decide when a new DOI is issued. And so we do allow editing that keeps the same DOI. And you're given that choice of, do I want to, is this a major enough change that it should be a new DOI, or is this a minor enough change that it should stay the same DOI? I think the next big piece of that to really make that strong is adding the versioning. We have versioning behind the scenes. We don't currently put it in the DOI. So that would be the next step, so that in fact the DOI citation tells you exactly which version of that data. And the other method, so one method would be through the accepted, or by putting a version string in the actual citation, in the main body of the citation. And we're still looking at which one we want to do. There's also been a lot of work Joan actually has led on sample identifiers. That's kind of another, that's not necessarily the data citation, but it's incredibly important for if you've taken soil samples, water samples, things like that. By having a sample unique ID and in a standardized system, now all the data systems can start to directly identify that and remember it, such that the end user could now search across the various databases looking for all of the analyses of that sample, things like that. And I think one of the really nice things about this particular work is that even the decision to do it was driven by the users who came to us and said, one of the most important things that we could do would be to get sample IDs working. And so that's one thing we focused on, and Joan's done an incredible job with that. But that was a separate webinar, so I won't talk about it too much further now, but there's a link at the bottom of the slide. So one of the problems that we've run into in some of the projects is that in many of the very large scale projects, there's a large number of related data sets, because the data set is often chosen based on the authorship, based on the campaign, based on what types of data it is, things like that. But often the user is looking across a watershed or across a system. And so they want to be able to reuse the data using a large number of data packages. So on one hand, as Joan just pointed out, we're encouraging data citation. But on the other hand, when it becomes 300 data citations that you have to provide, there are issues with that. And so one of the pieces that we've been looking at is, what are the methods for how you can do these large numbers of citations, and how do we want to guide the users to doing that? And that's part of this conversation today with you, because we do have these large interdisciplinary teams, the SFAs, the NGs, the things like Ameriflux, that are all creating large numbers of these data sets that could be brought together to make it easier for the end user to cite them. But we also don't want to lose that credit aspect either. So one of those examples is Ameriflux. We have 374 independent sites with independent authorship that contribute data into Ameriflux. That ends up being 2,482 site years right now. And there's separate team member groups at each of these sites. So they have their own authorship. They've been building this data set. Some of these sites have been in existence for over 25 years. And so it's a major piece of work. Those teams have changed over time. The ideal digital library response would have been that we should have put a DOI per year. We chose not to do that because that makes the user's job to cite 2,482 to be a little bit out of bounds, because that by definition they can't do. So, and the other piece is that data record is often reprocessed, the whole data record. So the authorship can be hard to sort of who is the author of that data that I now reprocessed that was done 10 years ago. So what we chose to do there was to aggregate the years all up into one file and give it a single DOI, and have the team put the full authorship across it. But that was one way to start to enable that scaling. All the sites agreed to that approach. But in the case of all these projects, we don't have such an easy way to do that. And even with having put one DOI per site, we still have the problem if someone uses the whole Ameriflux dataset, they have 374 citations that they have to add to their citations. As we all know, the top journals don't allow that many citations in the papers. So let's talk about how we go about citing large numbers of data sets. So current practices and what's often the answer from journals and from some of the guidance nowadays is one, ideally put a table of data in the paper. List the DO, some of the groups are suggesting listing DOIs in the acknowledgements, and in fact, some of the earlier Ameriflux guidance said to just put them in the acknowledgements. So when you look up Ameriflux papers, you just find it in the acknowledgements, which means it's not going to be counted in the credit for those. A lot of authors are providing the DOIs in line and not in the references section. And a lot of the publications are recommending, when we have these large number of citations, to put them in the supplementary material, which, even if it's formatted in a nice form, which Nature and Science are starting to move toward, it's still not currently indexed into the citation counts and things like that. The other thing that most of the publishers now recommend is that the author of the paper that they're submitting create a data paper about the data that they have that they worked on, because then they can also include their methods and their software and other things in that data paper, and then to cite the data paper. And then one of the other current practices is just no mention of it, particularly if it's their own data, because they're not used to citing their own data. So moving people to recognize that you have to cite your own data too, partially for that reusability and traceability of the analyses. And at the moment, none of these are indexed well. Okay, and so that's a real problem, and they're not currently planned for indexing in the future. So you're literally going to be relying on Google search to find the uses of the data. So there are many existing proposed methods for creating these collective data citations. One is a data collection. That's to group together several data sets, papers, and other things into a grouping and then give it a DOI, where any group could decide to make a collection and give a DOI. There's the data papers, which we already talked about. There's another thing called dynamic data citations. This is can be done by a repository. It's within a repository today, where the whole idea is that in your search to find the data, you generated a query that if you give a DOI to that query and a date, then in fact that DOI could be used to find exactly which date that person used. And a few of the biology databases have used that approach. We'll talk about some of the challenges of that in a minute. So the nice property is you get a single DOI, even though there was a lot of data sets. But now that original data set is cited through a citation of a citation, not directly a citation. So it's a secondary citation, which is, there's no guarantees about how that gets counted in terms of credit. But generally papers aren't considered, in the secondary citation, you just don't get as much credit for that. Also, most of these methods require that the repository itself implement a great deal of mechanisms and then maintain them in perpetuity. And since most of these methods are still in development, that can be a challenge because there's no guarantee that any of these actually have long-term uptake. And it's still difficult to track the specific contributions of different data sets, right? Because when you bring together these collective groups, now, let's say we take the 374 Ameriflex data sets and make them a collection, and then people cite that collection. Now, tracking which specific sites did this particular paper use gets even worse. So there's a lot of challenges with these various methods. So we wanted to do one more poll. Joan, I'm going to stop share and I'm going to let you share the results, I think, because I'm betting this isn't going to work for me to share them. So go back to the poll if you guys could complete this last poll.
We only see the last question. We're not able to answer the new questions.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to go back to talking. And if you guys can answer the poll while I'm talking, that'd be great. It gives us a sort of a window into how you all are thinking about it. So we have a few recommendations for authors and reviewers of scientific papers. And that's that data used to develop analyses, conclusions in a paper should be cited in the reference section using the citation text. So in our case, the citation text provided by ESS-DIVE. That data should be published and publicly available before citing it in a paper. Obviously, that's not always possible, but ideally that's the case so that you have the DOI, you have all the right citation information to include in your paper. There is this point of appropriately crediting in your data publication the people with substantial involvement in the creation of the data set. That's always a bit of a challenge because, as even with papers, I mean, the contributions aren't equal. The method provided for that is that you can designate your authors for the data set, and then you can designate your contributors whose metadata will all be there within the metadata. So it'll be picked up in searches and things like that, but it won't add them to your author list. And that's where you can provide the institution that funded you, other groups that were involved in helping to analyze the data to provide additional input, but who didn't necessarily provide a contribution that was worthy of authorship of this data set. So that's, as with papers, it's up to the individual authors to figure out who should be in the author list, who should be contributors. But that's another important point in here. So our next steps for citations, I'm just winding up here. We're trying to develop recommendations for citations. We want to have a broad community discussion of methods and tools for citing large numbers of data sets. We've got a paper that's just being published about our thoughts on that. And also Joan's going to embark on a citation analysis of ESS-DIVE datasets to understand how they're being cited and reused and the characteristics of these highly cited data sets, and trying to understand what we can do to help in that situation. So I'd like to pause there, or actually end there, and enable questions. In the slide deck, which will be posted, there's also sort of a glossary right after this so that folks who heard a term that they didn't recognize can look those up in the glossary. So with that, I'm going to stop the share These are some of the contact information for how to contact us. Here's our Twitter address for how to follow us. And we are always looking for feedback on these webinars. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my share so that we can see everybody and have a chat. So questions or thoughts?
I'll go. We started practicing putting hand in so we don't all start talking at once, but if there's a moment of silence, I'll go ahead and jump in. So thanks, John and Deb. I really appreciate that you've both been deeply thinking about the complexity of this, because you have a ton of data already and are running up against some problems. I'm on the other end where we're trying to sort of set something up from the beginning, and so I don't know how successful it'll be, but if this applies to your examples or not. What we're thinking for the National Microbiome Data Collaborative is allowing people to create, like, in real time, sort of, and I can't use Amazon as the example anymore because nobody likes Amazon, but like the shopping cart of data sets that they've gotten from the portal that they want to then combine as sort of a meta-analysis for a subsequent publication, and trying to understand how we can assign a DOI sort of like data collection landing page that they're going to use for the publication that pulls data from a bunch of other places. And working with OSCE and working on others, like, how can we make sure that the DOI daisy chain actually get propagated then to things like data citing, ORCID, and Crossref. But that's how we're going to try it. And I don't know if that's something that would maybe work, and that, because I want to make sure that, like, that collection DOI does a very good job of pulling all of the persistent identifiers and DOIs from those individual components of various data sets. But I don't know how deep that data chain is going to go. To Joan's point, like, there are a lot of publishers still that don't necessarily recognize DOI metadata in a way that's impactful. So I think that's a longer conversation, but I just wanted to throw that out. If you had tried something like that, if it was working, not working, if you thought it would work for what you're.
So we were planning on doing something like that. And then we started really looking at, because data collections and dynamic data DOIs or dynamic data citations are almost the same, right? If you just consider a query to also be a list, then honestly, what you're doing is either of those answers, and it makes a lot of sense. And a lot of people are starting to advocate for those. The main reason why I have not yet implemented one of those is because and honestly, if you want a really good example of a group that's sort of gone whole hog on this, GBIF has really gone crazy on this. The challenge that I see is that since there's no guarantee that Crossref and these other groups will treat these as primary citations down inside these collections, and there's no guarantee that all the search mechanisms will recognize this as a collection and as a reference at all, right? At the moment, dataset references aren't even recognized. So I don't have that much confidence yet that they're going to be recognized as well. So I view the one challenge with doing what you're choosing, and that GBIF has bought, is that you will have created a whole set of DOIs and a whole set of promises to your data contributors that you will always be able to sort of provide them that information of that they're a primary citation to that work. And I guess what I've been doing is actually dragging my feet, hoping that the community would come up with an answer that we would have more clarity on, and that the publishers would actually have said, yes, this this is how we want to do it. We are starting a discussion group on exactly this topic. So I'd be happy to include you. We're working with some of the earth science community, Shelley Stahl and Carolyn Coward. And we're going to build a group with the publishers and with a bunch of these groups to start talking about how do we do this to make this actually something that is a sustainable system. for us, as somebody who took over a repository from somebody else, I have to say everything that was legacy that they had that wasn't part of the standard now, we had to pretty much say, we'll make a copy of that thing and it'll be there, but it's static. Nobody can ever run it again. And that's part of what's made me very pragmatic about adopting too early. Because I look at those things and I say, there's no guarantee into the future that that looks anything other than a primary citation that references a bunch of things in the future to a later system that looks at that. And so that's caused that, for me at least, I've recommended to us that we wait to do that until we have a year or two under our belt and can try to get more clarity. On Ameriflex, it's already a dire need, but I've held them off so far because I don't want to give them a solution that means that all of those publications went, are just as bad as putting it in the supplementary material. At least in the supplementary material, they have some confidence that Google will eventually find it. Once I embed it in this, it's less clear to me that guarantees that.
That's a good point. I mean, I think there are some parallel efforts that are trying to push on this from a variety of angles. So I'd love to be part of that working group. I know that, it has the schema.org group that are trying to make sure that the data citations then do get indexed by Google in a meaningful way. So those landing pages would be more discoverable outside of the publication field. But yeah, I think there's many side conversations that need hopefully to come together into some alignment.
Right. No, that's great. Other thoughts or discussion points?
This is probably just a minor thing and it might actually be taken care of by using ORCID IDs, but it seems that often when you're putting in the names of data set authors into systems to upload data, say like the NG Arctic Archive or Tropics or ESS-DIVE, it's limited to like first name, last name. And then when the automatic citation is generated, you don't get the author's preferred kind of citable name. But again, whether ORCID, having the ORCID IDs covers that, and it doesn't matter. Just a thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think ORCID is our best shot at that we have ever seen, which is why we've gone with ORCID. But yeah, no, that is a challenge. It's always been a challenge on papers. Yeah, I used to love that I was the only D. Agarwal publishing in anything close. And then some biologist went off and it was D. Agarwal. And from then on, I couldn't find my papers. Other comments or questions? Right. So there's a comment from Elisha about the or Alicia. How do you pronounce your name?
It's Alicia.
Alicia. Okay. Yeah, the credit attribution system is gaining some ground, at least in the earth sciences. In fact, the AGU open publication in earth sciences is specifically requiring that you use the credit system to define the author roles. And that's the problem is right now, that's only for the author roles of the paper. There is work going on right now to do the same vocabulary for a data set and for data authors. That hasn't yet been done. I mean, that's underway. So a lot of this landscape is, I mean, we're standing on mushy ground as we make these decisions. What you'll see out of ESS-DIVE is a very pragmatic approach where we try to drag our feet until the path becomes more clear. So we'll tend not to be early adopters of most things, and instead more pragmatic about the approach. For instance, that's why we haven't done a DOI series and then a meta DOI on each data set, because the only reason I would do it is so that you could exactly track the version back to the paper, you know, for the paper and things. And I haven't seen reuse be of large enough utilization of, I have to have that version for me to put that much effort into a whole structure that does that, purely because that's what's recommended by the digital libraries community. You know, in 14 years of working with Ameriflex, no one has ever asked me for the old version of that data. They always want the latest version. And after 14 years of never having been asked, I don't build infrastructure for it. We have it. We can always answer that question, but it's not something we put in. So we've reached the hour. Feel free to reach out to us with other questions you might have, other thoughts. We'd love to hear from folks about their thoughts on the collective citations particularly, because this is something we're going to be working on and studying for, you know, pretty intensely over the next 6 months to a year to try to come up with what is the right solution here. So thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you.